Hello, everybody. I'm Paweł Mościcki. This is podcast Inny Świat, Another World. I'm very happy to say that we start the format of conversations in English. So we are opening up our audience, but also our partners in dialogue and debate. So I'm very happy to inform you that this is the first episode in this new format. But of course, as usually, I'm asking you, or maybe even more than usually, to share, subscribe, like, comment on this video. And if you even have the opportunity and the need to support us financially, you can do it at patronite.pl/Inny Świat, the name of our podcast. And without further ado, I would like to present our today's guests, and I'm really very happy and very honored that he accepted our invitation. I'm here with Volodymyr Ishchenko, a Ukrainian sociologist who is a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at Freie Universität in Berlin. He was also lecturing in Kiev Mohyla Academy and Kiev Polytechnic Institute. He is the author of many articles, essays, and also public appearances that concerned the recent history of Ukraine and more generally post-Soviet countries and region. He's also an author of a book recently published by Bardzo, Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War. And I have to say that he's one of those people who always brings a very inspiring and very interesting analysis and arguments. Hello, Volodymyr. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me and for this very generous introduction.
We were discussing a little bit our today's conversation in advance, and we decided that we'll try to talk about, of course, your book, but also another arguments and analysis that you brought up in recent years. But I would like to present them or introduce them in a slightly let's say, polemical way, although I think on most points I would more or less agree with what you say. I mean, I'm not at the level of analysis that you present, but my freedom is to always agree or not. But I would try to represent or be an advocate of a point of view that I don't share normally, but just for the sake of our amusement, but also for training in the sincerity of our arguments. This is how I treat it, and it's always good to refresh, your own position, trying to understand people who argue for something completely different. And I would like to start with the start of your book, actually, because you start with introducing a position which is very, very unheard of, say, in most of Polish public debates, but I would claim maybe also European or even Western, so to speak, at least in the mainstream. And this is the position that you call yourself wrong Ukrainian. And well, I kind of joked to myself that this talk would be between, wrong Pole and wrong Ukrainian. So we're in a good company. But but I would like to ask you first about how you define this position and to what extent you are at odds with what Ukrainian identity or Ukrainian stance comes from, and also maybe an additional question, because we hear it very often, that we shouldn't debate, we shouldn't talk about Ukrainian conflict and the Ukrainian recent history without including the voice and the position of Ukrainians themselves, which is a very good argument, but which Ukrainians we really have in mind. And so maybe I will ask you to present this position of a wrong Ukrainian and how you deal with presenting this kind of perspective.
Thank you, Pavel. That's an important question. But first, it's important to make it clear, because this is a bit of misreading what I'm saying in the book. A wrong Ukrainian is not a self-description, right? So that would be kind of like pejorative and even kind of like self-humiliating, right? So why am I exactly wrong Ukrainian? Maybe there's other wrong Ukrainians, and maybe actually the people who claim to be the Ukrainians are wrong Ukrainians. So wrong Ukrainian, obviously, it has an irony, right? So the situation in the public discussion that you touched upon, that it's kind of like there is a very strong dominant discourse about what Ukrainian identity is, what Ukrainian interests are, the Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian interests. Well, it's not kind of like politically correct to say the Ukraine, but well, substantially they speak about some very specific idea of what Ukraine is, right? And when someone like me, and it's you should understand that I'm far from being unique in this capacity. It's rather the asymmetry of what is represented in the English-speaking discourse. You hear the other positions much more often. That when someone like me says something differently, there is this tendency to start questioning whether Ukrainians even can even think like this, whether this is Ukrainian, or whether this is simply some Russian propaganda repeated by Russian propagandists, and whatever credentials you have, whatever background you have, there is a kind of like coherent and very voiceful group of people who would start to question your own identity. It just doesn't matter that I lived in Kyiv for almost all of my life. I've studied in Ukrainian universities. I taught in Ukrainian universities. I was active in Ukrainian left-wing politics for almost 20 years, in fact, and even after I left Ukraine in 2019. So, and I'm not a wrong Ukrainian. At least I don't feel like this. I feel I'm one of Ukrainians, and I think that is also kind of like politically important thing to say. To argue against this homogenization of Ukraine. In all those discussion about the voices and this is touch on decoloniality and similar discourses, presenting a nation and a complex and a modern nation and a big nation as something homogeneous, it's pretty much colonial discourse about Ukraine. Ukraine is a complex country. And furthermore, it has become even more dispersed, even more heterogeneous during the war. And despite that's very dominant claim that Ukrainians has become united. If you look kind of like objectively, what happened with Ukraine, you can make this claim about the unity of Ukraine if only you simply exclude Ukrainians who stayed in Crimea. And only a minority actually left Crimea when Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014. Quite a small minority. You also don't think about Ukrainians in Donbass, also excluded from Ukrainian polity since 2014. You are not thinking about Ukrainians in Russia. Ukrainians were actually the third largest minority in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, according to the census in 1989, the last Soviet census. The first group was Russians, obviously, then Tatars, and the third group were Ukrainians. 4 million of Ukrainians who lived in the Soviet Russia. In the post-Soviet years, they have largely assimilated. And so in the latest Russian census, which also included Crimea, about 800,000 people in Russia claimed Ukrainian identity. But still, that's some considerable group. And plus, Ukrainian migrant workers who were not permanent residents or citizens of Russia, but were coming from Ukraine to Russia to work. And that flow of migrant workers continued, even if it became a bit smaller, but it still continued even after 2014, even after annexation of Crimea and start of the war in Donbass. And then a big flow of refugees from Ukraine. A bigger part went to the European Union, but also a very considerable part, according to the United Nations estimations, which could be questioned because they probably rely on Russian sources. But that's the most official thing that we might have by now. They claim, well, 2-3 million of Ukrainians who came to Russia as refugees. Why they could come to Russia, to the country which attacked Ukraine? Because they had relatives in Russia, they have some parts of their families in Russia, because they speak Russian, because they felt that they could integrate better in Russia. And also the people who were in the occupied areas, well, that was for them perhaps the easiest route to escape from the war zone. Right? So that's a considerable group of people who are Ukrainians who still retain Ukrainian passports, who may feel themselves Ukrainians, and to which extent they are even present in the public discussions about Ukraine. And then furthermore, Ukrainians in the European Union, well, this number is fluctuating. Some people go back to Ukraine, then they come back to EU. Most of them are actually in Poland and in Germany, but also many in other countries, Czech Republic in particular. And to which extent their positions, interests are included into the discussions about the Ukraine. And this is also a diverse group of people, some of whom are, well, one of the recent things that the Ukrainian state required all Ukrainian men on the military duty to update the contact data for the military recruitment offices, even if they actually stay outside of Ukraine. This is a requirement, and the overwhelming majority of Ukrainian men abroad, the rough estimations give over 90%, did not report their contact data. They do not. They are not going to come back and fight for Ukraine. And so, when Ukrainian state, or Ukrainian elite, or Ukrainian civil society claims something on behalf of all Ukrainians, do they include this very large group of draft dodgers? And furthermore, again, we have not exactly reliable data of the Ukrainian population. The last census in Ukraine was conducted in 2001, so over 20 years ago. And when Zelensky actually was elected, there was a big discussion how many people in Ukraine are actually present. The data coming from the estimations from the economic transactions gave much lower number of people than the official demographic attempts to calculate them. And so, according to Zelensky quasi-census, there was about 37, 38 million of people, several million less than the demographic statistics were given. And so every man between 18 and 60 was supposed to report their contact data. And the number of these people was estimated between 9 and 11 million. But only 4.5 million actually did this. So likely less than 50%. That means that over 50% of Ukrainian men on military duty are technically draft dodgers. And they are going to face quite serious fines and also serious complications in everyday life and work. So does Ukrainian state, Ukrainian elite and civil society speak on behalf of these Ukrainians? And when, right, we understand this dispersal of Ukrainian nations, the variety of interests, the very strong disagreements, even about such existential questions as this war, right? And we see how large this group of people, and even if we also consider those people who reside in Ukraine, who didn't go anywhere, but have a divergent opinion, which is only very imperfectly measured in the public opinion polls, which became less reliable after the war started. It seems like these supposedly wrong Ukrainians may actually be the majority of all Ukrainians in the world. And so well, this is an important statement. The wrong Ukrainians are not wrong. They are underrepresented. They have much less representation in the public and political spheres. That is true. But this doesn't mean that they are some marginal minority. This doesn't mean that they are wrong in any political, ethical, or other sense. Well, it's basically an irony, right? It's an irony that should be explained. But at the same time, this is not a way to go into some symmetrical identity politics. Or please hear our voices. No, I believe it's quite wrong way to go. It's not about this multiplication of unheard voices. Because, well, I also speak just on behalf of myself and also on behalf of my studies that I've been conducting about Ukrainian politics for 20 years. We shouldn't go into this saying that, okay, these Ukrainians are represented, but those Ukrainians are not represented. But again, if you include those, we need to include someone else, and the third and the fourth and the fifth group. I believe this is the wrong way. And one of the most important claims in my book is that actually we need to think about what we as Ukrainians can contribute to the global problems and to the universal issues. Not going to more and more particularistic, parochial discourses and problems, but trying to universalize our disaster. I mean, universalizing obviously in the intellectual sense, not in the creating the full, the global catastrophe from Ukraine, which is actually one of the serious risks, how this war may develop.
Yeah, thanks very much. Of course, the irony was obvious for me, and I would never claim, you have in any sense wrong position. I mean, it's just is just interesting as a figure. I also think I feel that way, and I have been treated that way as a Pole that has something is wrong in his brain and obviously in his identity, because Poles are supposed to think the same thing all the time. And by the way, there is an interesting similarity, because the Polish government and Polish elite, I mean political establishment, so to speak, is, I think, the most pro-war in the world now. Maybe, I mean, in Europe for sure, maybe with the Baltic states on an equal level, but the society, when you see the polls and so on, is not there. I mean, the majority refuses any attempt of Poland joining this conflict, or in any sense sending troops or whatever, and it does not exclude a sympathy or solidarity even with the plight of Ukraine as a nation and Ukrainians as a society. But that's here just political views of the elites and the broader society completely diverge. I think that what you brought at the end of your argument today, that we have to look for political discussions and universal questions rather than this multiplication of identities, which of course presuppose some umbrella, which is never discussed and never really touched upon. But I, as an advocate of a different opinion today, I would say yes, but the universal questions were also historically very often a kind of hidden agenda of Western powers and their point of view, and we here in our region, we have to realize what we have gone through historically. We know better than them what kind of risk Russia is presenting today and always. So we should not fall into this universalistic claims of, I don't know, we don't need World War, we have to count on peace negotiations, or we have to include others' points of view and so on, because this is just the Western talk and West-splaining, a very popular category that is policing our discourse today. But I, as an advocate, yeah, this is how the argument goes. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I need to say that we don't need the Third World War, and this is not West-splaining. This is not the Western talk. This is simply, let's say, common sense. Well, I can imagine that some people would also question what common sense is, but I think that would become a too extreme position, that we might actually need the World War III. No, we don't need this, and this points to that there is some potential to have a discussion about the universal interests grounded in some objective commonality between the human beings. And one of them is that humans want to live and not to be annihilated in the nuclear war. That's one thing. So that would be just the basic response, that allegedly we cannot talk about the universal interest. It is true that it's been typical that the particular interests were misrecognized and covered up as supposedly universal. That's also true about when we speak about so-called national interests.
Yeah.
It's typically the interest of the elite or the ruling class. And if you go quite far enough, we'll simply end in this bad infinity, going into this multiplicity of particular positions that cannot lead anywhere than to complete atomization and fragmentation. When in the cheerleading for the multiplicity of voices that all supposedly have equal value, we go into the situation when we cannot have any discussion at all. That would be simply my voice against your voice. We need to assume that there is some universal, shared, common ground, building on which we can create some collectivity, some collective action and collective coordination around our common problems. And we do have common problems. And well, this push towards particularism is a manifestation of the hegemony crisis. The less and less capacity of the ruling elite on the national and on the global level as well. On the global level, we're speaking about primarily the Western elites, to claim that they lead common interests, global interests, universal interests. And so, response to that, you are not representing us. You are not speaking on behalf of us. This response is understandable, but not constructive. And so the opposition to that should be rather the articulation of the universal interest in an alternative way. Not simply saying, we know better what happens here simply because of our identity. And well, some people actually claim this identity without even living for some considerable part of their life in Ukraine or Russia or anywhere in the region. But the argument should be that the war in Ukraine is creating a whole set of globally relevant problems about, obviously, the stable peace, obviously about the international order, but also about the economic structure, about global imperialism, about nationalism. Many of the questions that have much broader relevance, and to which we should think about universally relevant solutions that would go beyond the Ukraine, beyond the region. And that would actually would be beneficial to explain what happens in Ukraine in a much more comprehensible way. One of the problems with this attacks on so-called West-splaining is that this attacks typically reproduce very much Western discourses.
Yes.
And what is actually
100%.
labeled as West-splaining has less support in the West properly, and has more support in the global South, which looks at what happens in Ukraine and in how it is described in Ukraine and by pro-Ukrainian public in the West with large skepticism. And there is some objective cause. There are some objective causes and background behind it. There is some history behind it. And well, if you just stay in this, it leads nowhere. It is not a it is not a condition for articulating a better and progressive politics. And instead, the way out is in universalizing.
Yeah. Well, I think one could say that, how Western politicians and Western mainstream media present this conflict is a kind of universalistic language, in a sense that this is a global clash between democracies on the one hand, which are represented by the West, European Union, United States, and on the other hand, the autocracies or dictatorships such as Russia, such as China, of course, and such as Iran. I mean, there was no much talk about Iran at the beginning of the war, but now, of course, more and more for obvious reasons. But this is a kind of universalizing language. And after reading your book, I kind of feel that you don't buy into this opposition. And my question maybe would be why you don't fall for this. But I would like to precise a little bit the question as well, because I think that this language of a global conflict between these forces of good and evil, or democracy and autocracy, they can function only on the basis of certain narratives and certain description of what happened actually in recent history of the region, and what the war is all about, how it started, what really initiated it. And that's why I would like to go to the question of Maidan, because I think if you look for the moment that really kind of changed the very coordinates of the problem, it was long ago, but now it's 10 years, 10th anniversary. I think that the narrative of this big global opposition would say that the Maidan was the spark of democracy that started within a still very autocratic Ukraine, and that expressed the longing of Ukrainian society to democracy in the Western sense of the term. And then what happened was Russia initiating the so-called separatist movement, and then slowly but surely invading Ukraine step by step. These people would also claim, I think, that the invasion really started in 2014 with Donbass uprising, so to speak, so-called in the discourse, so-called uprising. But you in your book, you are talking about Maidan extensively and very, I would say, very critically, not in the essentialist sense, but in the historical analysis of what happened with these manifestations. But you also talk about Maidans in plural, and I think you refer to popular resistance in the eastern Ukraine as something more genuine and more grassroots that it's usually presented in our media, because normally it is presented as just a cover-up for the actual invasion of Russia, the first steps of this invasion. So maybe I would like you to touch upon this Maidans in plural a little bit, but in the context of this, so-called or supposedly universalizing narrative of the clash between democracy and autocracy.
Well, these are many questions, but I actually wanted to comment on how you started about this, that there is a universalizing language coming from the Western elites. There is universalizing language, but the problem is that not only just some wrong Ukrainian doesn't believe in that. The question should be put like this: who actually believe in this? Well, who actually believe that this is the war for democracy and against autocracy? No, there are people. who would defend this. There are many people like this, but is it the majority of the world, the majority of the global population? Especially if you look to the south, especially if you look to the east, from where we are. I mean, that's again, that's we have this dominant discourse in the public sphere, and I think we should simply feel I mean, more kind of like stronger, vindicated against it. That if you look at the recent history, what the Western elites were doing, to which extent the claims for that they actually represent something that could be called global democracy is convincing. I mean, from the start of the war in the Middle East, it's too few people, let's say, would take it as a face value. The hegemony crisis of the Western ruling class is escalating. And there is universalizing language, but there should be also some appropriate politics behind it. The economy should actually grow to provide the material basis to claim that we are, the elites are pushing forward the common interests. There should be institutions. There should be no such thing that we are against one aggression, but we are for another aggression, that we are against one autocracy, but we are still allies with another autocracies, simply because they fit better with the elite interests. That's not something that can be taken at face value, and we should be very clear about this. This is not the language that is believed by the majority of humanity. And unless some really fundamental change is going to happen to support this language of the fight for democracy against autocracy, it rather leads to further discrediting of the Western elites and further escalation of the hegemony crisis. The Ukrainian story, I mean, there's just too many other things that could be told about how the conflict has started. And I have a chapter in the book which is called Maidan Mythology, which has actually originally was a review on one of the first books about Euromaidan Ukraine crisis by Andrew Wilson, who is among the most known Western experts on Ukraine. And writing that review was kind of like almost like a constant fight with with manipulation, with exaggeration, with omission of some very important things that should have been acknowledged. Sometimes with what I start to see is simply gaslighting. People just literally see that this is not true, but they continue to state that, no, this is what exactly happened. One of those things, for example, the importance of the far right in Euromaidan and in the post-Euromaidan Ukrainian politics, and now how the military units under command of the far right militants, they're becoming more and more legitimized and not even questioned not only within Ukraine, but also much rarely questioned in the Western public sphere.
Oh.
Although Azov was actually a big story in the Western media before the full-scale invasion started. Then Russia invaded, and then all those complications and mentioning that these are people actually with quite extreme politics, they went into the background and mentioned only in very rare public.
No, it's an absolute taboo in Poland, for example. It changed 180 degrees, like from the day to the other. It's a taboo. You cannot talk about.
Well, and it has become a taboo, and why? I mean, even though these units have become so visible, just thinking about the scale of Ukrainian military now, about 1 million people, those brigades connected to Azov is just a small minority, right? So it's not something completely indispensable. And
well,
why they're not questioned? It's not because of some military
power that they have.
need, but because the Ukrainian and Western elites choose to not question this. They do have a choice, and they make this choice to continue legitimate and glorify these units, which actually did have political impact on Ukraine, even though they have not been represented in the parliament since the elections in 2014.
Well, just quickly to continue, my role as an advocate of this point of view, I would say that the argument that I have been confronted with in Polish discourse, at least, but I think it's really the same format everywhere. It's that first, since these units were involved, accepted into the general military, they were de-radicalized. This is the old story, and all these questions were maybe relevant in the beginning of the post-Maidan Ukraine, but now it's just not at all. They are all pro-Western. They all accept Western values and Western requirements. Of course, that the whole discourse about the far right is Russian propaganda. That Russia has same units in its own army, so there is an equivalence somehow. I don't know how it works really, but I've heard this argument. And then finally, something that you mentioned is that the polling of parties that used to be understood or treated as a far-right parties is minuscule. So the society would never accept this kind of presence. But there still is a problem. Why these units have so much influence, and why this taboo everywhere? But these are arguments that I was confronted with, and I think they don't conform with any analysis of reality and logic, but they are there, and they are very pervasive. And I would say you started by saying who believes it, and the surprising thing is that, well, when I see the Polish public debate, it's not even the majority; it's almost the totality of this public sphere, which is just on board, both with the us representing democracy and so on, and secondly, the unity and also unproblematic character of Maidan revolution. Just one last thing is that I think that how in Poland, at least, it's narrated, the Maidan event is very similar to how we were accustomed and actually trained into accepting the narrative about transformation after the fall of Soviet Poland, because it's called Revolution of Dignity, Maidan, and I think that I'm not trying to make fun of it, because it's a very important event, and I understand why people tried and decided to go to the streets and so on. It's a very legitimate move, but you know, the narrative is as if it's just dignity came from the sky and just, you know, spread around the country. And the same went with transformation. It was just liberty that somehow finally touched our, you know, forgotten country, which was just a concentration camp for 50 years. And now it's just, we are free, and freedom is just, you know, you can touch it, you can feel it, and that's the whole, the whole image, you know. You don't have to question and debate anything because the liberty is there, basically, and we are free by definition.
Well, you are right that this is probably the discourse in Poland, but my question would be: is Poland representative of the whole world?
No, of course not. Of course.
And so, again, the claim is to think about this in the global perspective. And in the global perspective, the discourse is not like this. And this is not because of West planning, but because objectively, there is a reproduction of the structures of both economic, but also the ideological structures that start to be seen less and less persuasively in too many parts of the world and by too many people. And well, you've just mentioned the claims about Ukrainian far right that are indeed dominant in the Western public sphere and obviously in Ukraine, they just cannot stand up against the facts. This is one of the examples that I would simply call denialism, politically driven denialism. It just when you simply call black as white and white as black, the units under command of the people with huge history of the far-right militancy, suddenly it's supposed to not to matter. The spread of the like literally Nazi symbols, even beyond Azov, it's supposed that it doesn't matter. The legitimation of the Ukrainian radical nationalism supposedly doesn't matter. They think that actually those officers of Azov and some other units connected to the far right, that they openly say in their social networks, in Ukrainian media, and which explicitly far-right nationalists, they are not reported. So just one of the recent events in Lviv, there was a big conference of the European far-right, and quite extreme right.
I saw it,
It would be probably to call them neo-Nazi than simply far-right. So it's far more to the right than, well, German alternative for Deutschland. Dritte Weg, in particular, I'm not sure who was there from Poland, but
I haven't seen any Polish, but it was just a clip, so I'm not saying there were no Polish organizations. Probably they were.
Yeah, probably no, but Dritte Weg, Casa Pound, the organization was very explicit neo-Nazi.
I think that Polish far right
coming to Ukraine, and why they come to Ukraine, right? There is some milieu for them to speak with their Ukrainian brothers in arms. And well, why does it not matter anymore? And so this is the situation when some real trends and facts appear as not important, non-existent, doesn't matter, and the part of the Western elite discourse works on just basic denialism of what's going on. That should be compared to the climate change denialism, in particular, to the COVID denialism. To that extent. And the argument is, this is only because of the war. No, it doesn't hold. It also not convincing at all. Because these units and the Ukrainian far right are not that important in the Ukrainian struggle. There is no military need to legitimate them. And furthermore, the silence about these issues, the silence about Ukrainian variety, about Ukrainian ethno-nationalism, about those policies that started to dominate Ukrainian politics, not after 2022, but after 2014, only partially in response to what Russia did in Crimea and in Donbass, but also continuing those, actually the dream of Ukrainian nationalists to transform Ukraine in their image and likeness, the dream that they actually had since 1990s. But only now they've got the great opportunity to change Ukraine in the way that they wanted to. And for a big part of the Ukrainian nationalist milieu, bigger than the far-right segment of it, the post-Soviet Ukrainian state was kind of like deficiently legitimate. It was kind of like a wrong state, still dominated by the post-Soviet elites, still having that Soviet legacy in the institutions, in the economy, politics, culture, very strong up until 2014. And even then, only very gradually, it was kind of like erased and silenced. And because of the war, and they found an opportunity to do this, to pursue so-called naive solutions, as some of those nationalist intellectuals, also actually perceived as liberals, not as far-right ultra-nationalists, but what we typically refer as Ukrainian liberals, speaking about naive solutions for so-called decolonization of Ukraine. That also means the effectively erasure of the Soviet legacy, of the Russian language presence in the public sphere, and the policies that were developing and that were started from 2014 and only escalated after 2022. So what Russia does is not always the cause of Ukrainian nationalism, but it's very often is an opportunity.
Well, because one of the main arguments to say that there is no far right in Ukraine is that Russia is claims that one of the objectives of the invasion is the Nazification. So if they say it, that's wrong. So, and we don't need to even prove it because you know, this is just a propaganda that gives reason to a military invasion, and that would to claim that there is a presence of far rights in today's Ukraine would also shed a kind of light, negative light on the Ukrainians as a society. So, you know, that, so to speak, Ukrainians are just Nazis, which is of course nonsense, and it's nonsense everywhere. But I think this is how it works, and this is why it's such a convincing way of thinking for the majority of, at least people, you know, responsible for commentaries and opinions and so on. But maybe it's good to go a bit further here, and because this combination between westernization of Ukraine, this is how I understand, you know, this, just get rid of the Soviet past, you know, because everything Soviet is just wrong. I mean, we had it in Poland, in a total, we had Homo Sovieticus, you know, the very category to explain this strange species of people who are just backwards, and they just don't understand the West, and because they are still Soviet in their minds and behaviors and so on. But we forget the Soviet past and we move west And we also create the opportunity for expression of this nationalism, because this is very useful to complete this operation, because everyone that is going to be opposed to it would have to be treated very harshly and very, very decisively. And finally, I think that this is maybe something that brings us to the question of the class. You know, that this is, to nationalize the conflict is to obfuscate the fact that that it also involves, or maybe above all involves, class interest. You know, that this westward movement is a movement of a certain class of society, and it has a lot to do with their interests, and their interests are in conjunction with the global capital and who is responsible for managing it today.
Yeah, well, let me perhaps continue on this class aspect, because this is indeed something very much underplayed in understanding of the war. And well, if you look at the two dominant, or at least two most popular explanations for the war, why it has started. So one is so-called realist, that would point primarily to NATO expansion. I'm obviously very much simplifying the argument. Many people make it in a much more complex way. The problem is that we are not explained what was exactly the problem with NATO for Russia, and how exactly that conflict of interest was constituted, and why Russia was not invited to NATO, even when the Russian leaders were saying that should we consider applying to NATO. Putin said this to the American presidents. So why it happened that Eastern Europe was invited to NATO, but most of the post-Soviet countries were not? And foremost, Russia was not invited. And how this, if there was a conflict between Russia and NATO, how it has been constituted about that, and what were actually the interests of the elites behind it? And I don't think that it is possible to give a good answer to this question without considering the class, and precisely that class of kind of variety of capitalists who acquired the dominant positions in the Russian, but also in most of the post-Soviet states' economies, typically called oligarchs. I think there is a better term for that, political capitalists, in the way how Ivan Seleny, a great Hungarian sociologist, developed it, or Branko Milanovic, a very known economist. Actually speaking precisely about the post-socialist economy. So that fraction of capitalists whose major competitive advantage are their selective benefits from the state, in contrast to capitalists who rely more on the technological innovation or on the super exploitation of labor force. So for political capitalists, it's actually their privileged access to the state which provides their major competitive advantage. And that's the whole problem behind the discussion about the much of the intermingling of politics and business in the post-Soviet societies, so so-called oligarchy, so on and so forth. So the post-socialist transformations in Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular, went in a different way. It was not simply a disintegration where many of the former elite and of the connected people had acquired large chunks of large parts of the formerly state property, as it actually happened in the post-Soviet states. But the Eastern European transformation went through the, well, revolutionary process. And when the dissident civil society intellectuals had acquired more power. But at the same time, also the Western capital was more kind of like welcomed and acquiring significant parts of the Eastern European economy. So this created a very different political economy. And well, expansion of the NATO structure followed the very specific economic process, which did not happen in the post-Soviet countries. And I think that's very much underestimated in the discussion of the Russian NATO problem. Furthermore, okay, if you look at the different, also very popular, maybe even more popular perspective that focuses on the Russian, well, imperialistic ideology about Ukraine and the denial of the Ukrainian independent statehood, we should also consider that the conflict acquired this ethnic, ethno-nationalist dimension only pretty recently, in fact. And before, so the roots of the major political conflicts in the Soviet society were having rather classic social economic dimension. So that was again the disappointment with how the post-Soviet change was happening as a way of disintegration of the predatory privatization of the state property, which were not leading to those expected pro-Western changes, and which was rooted in the what has become known as civil society in post-Soviet states, having some roots in the dissident intelligentsia in the Soviet period, but also lately expanding to larger sections of the professional middle classes, acquiring, in the case of Ukraine, a specific political superstructure in the form of the NGOized civil society, and articulating the interests of and ideologies that we are excluded from this post-Soviet capitalism. It is wrong. We need to follow that Western direction, and we need to follow Poland in particular. We still need to have our 1989. And well, there have been also some intellectual connections between Euromaidan and 1989. It's kind of like a delayed 1989 for Ukraine. And at the same time, well, the quite big part of the actual Ukraine, of large minority, maybe even a majority Ukrainian population, in this westernized discourse was seen as, well, bydło, sowok. I'm not sure if there is the same word in Polish, but,
yes,
well,
exactly.
It's basically cattle. The people who do not have their own political subjectivity, who are just passive, who are just obedient, who are not even citizens in a proper sense.
Yeah.
And they don't matter for that liberal enlightened elite. Very much elitist.
Oh, yes.
And they look to the majority of that people who vote for Yanukovych, or vote for Putin, or for Lukashenko and other parts of the former Soviet Union as not properly human up to that point. As some groups in the society that could be disenfranchised, and there have been quite a popular discourse, for example, steal your grandma's passport because that grandma votes for communists.
We had the same action. We had the same ad. Really, steal the passport from your grandma because she's voting for far right. Meaning,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So that's a vision that actually a large part of the society is not even supposed to have public representation, because they have some fundamentally wrong opinion that just jeopardize our great dream to join Europe. even though the dream is shared not necessarily by the majority of the society. So I'm just pointing to how that very similar conflicts and ideologies existed in Ukraine, and they were intersecting with that ethno-national regional cleavage that is typically described as kind of like Western regions against Eastern regions, Russian speakers against Ukrainian speakers, which could be also kind of like articulated as the Russian post-colonial or the post-colonial legacy of Russian oppression in Ukraine. A part of the Ukrainian population that were Russified, colonized, communized, Sovietized, and only now we have the opportunity to enlighten them. The roots of the conflict are in class, in that specific way of how the post-Soviet capitalism was emerging, who was acquiring what, and who was protesting against it, and who had more public and political capacity to articulate their ideologies. Fundamentally, this is a conflict of political capitalists and their collective interests who could rely on passive support of electoral majorities against political bloc of professional middle class allied with transnational capital. That's the articulation of this class conflict. And only later it has been acquiring these ethno-national dimensions. Only gradually, only with the escalation of the conflict, to the most extent after the full-scale Russian invasion. And so to look at it as the story of some linear national liberation struggle would be an ideological, teleological nationalist narrative, which we simply retrospectively impose on a much more complicated history, which had different roots, which had different dimensions, and in this narrative, the political economy of that conflict is also kind of like becomes covered up and misrecognized, disguised.
Yeah, I think you have an argument in the book about the also class reasons of the decision that the Russian government made to invade Ukraine, which also I would say never appears on either side of the spectrum. You know, it never appears on the side of pro-Western and so-called pro-Ukrainian, pro-war, I would say, audience, because you don't need this argument, because Russia is just, you know, evil and hates democracy, and this is the explanation. But it also rarely appears on the side of either critically inclined analysts or pro-Russian public, you know, because then you would have this realist or some version of the realist argument, more or less, you know, explicitly pro-Russian or more balanced. But you claim that this is an interest of also a specific class within Russian society that is represented by this war, and this is the class that you call political capitalist after Szeleny and Milanovic. And here I have to say I don't know if I understood the argument correctly, so maybe I will play the advocate again, but on a different side of a different argument, because I think that, as far as I understood it, is that the interest of this class was the expansion of the territorial expansion, and in result the expansion of their income, which would come from the public services and the access to the state apparatus. Basically, this is it, or is it the keeping of certain privileges within the state, Russian state, that would be, I don't know, integrated, defended, and so on? Is it about the expansive aspect, or is it more about the security of the interests, which would be perhaps at risk when, I don't know, Ukraine would totally go to the Western, more global capital sphere of influence. So this is about the losing of certain connections under certain occasions to gain risk from the interconnections, or is it about the expansion of it for a specific territory and, of course, resources and all kinds of stuff that is connected with it? How do you understand? If I understood it correctly, because
this is a very important question, and the things that I'm still developing on in the pieces that will hopefully come soon. The argument made in the book, in that chapter, which is included into the book about the post-Soviet class conflict behind the Russian invasion, it's actually not about the precise decision making, right? So, well, I don't think that Putin was actually saying this. We are starting this invasion in the long-term interests of Russian ruling class. Sure. Putin could also be kind of like disguising the same interest in his ideological language, and his ideological language is not a language of the class.
No. It's unity. It's,
but at the same time, it just doesn't mean that the class interests are some kind of like simply some intellectual imposition on that. Because if you think about the start of the First World War, for example, the actual decision-making of the Austrian, Russian, German, British, French elites were not at the point when they were deciding to start the war, to start mobilization, to go into the war, that they actually didn't have any idea how long it may go and how catastrophic it is going to be for the whole Europe, and including for the ruling classes of the nations, at least of those who were defeated. It doesn't mean that the actual imperialistic competition of German capital against British capital, French capital, didn't matter. It actually mattered. It was the most fundamental structure that was leading to the ultimate escalation into the World War. So I'm thinking about the class interest in something like this. This is the fundamental conflict that structured the war. It structured the again, one of the things which is important to understand, that the full-scale invasion is just the latest escalation spiral of the developments that started much earlier. We need to go at least to 2014 and even before that. Right? So one of the things to consider is that discussion and conflict about the European Association Agreement for Ukraine or pursuing joining customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The discussion which was relevant up until 2014, up until the victory of Euromaidan. And it had fundamental economic meaning. So from the point of view of the Russian elites, why they needed the customs union, that was a way to exploit, to use the post-Soviet legacy to build a strong sovereign center of capital accumulation on the post-Soviet space. To use those links which remained from the Soviet Union, in particular in the heavy industry, in the aviation industry, in the weapons industry, and to bring them together and to become stronger. The expansion of the Western institutions, and in particular the European Association Agreement, but also of NATO. NATO actually has not just military component, it also has political economic component. Was precluding this project of the reintegration of the post-Soviet space under the in the unity of Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus are the most important parts of it. So that conflict had political economic dimension, foremost political economic, and the ideologies of about history, about the unity of Russians and Ukrainians. I don't think that they were in the root of that expansion, because they have started to be articulated only very much later. After the ideas and projects for the Eurasian integration have appeared. In the early 2010s, those projects started even early in the 2000s, the discussion was primarily about economy, not about the history of Ukrainians and Russians. So that's, and obviously in that, why we are speaking about class conflict, if that Eurasian integration would work, yes, it would asymmetrically benefit the Russian ruling class because it was the strongest one. And part of the reasons that, Yanukovych and the Ukrainian elite, which was kind of like for a certain period of time consolidated around Yanukovych, they were kind of like hesitating about that they did see a danger from Russia to their own interests, but they only opportunistically wanted to exploit the European association. So the play was not exactly smart for them. They believed that they could pursue EU association. It would give them some points in the coming elections. Yanukovych actually had a problem to be re-elected in the scheduled elections, and which was supposed to be in 2015. Maybe they could also, make some profits on some of the parts, but they also were not really serious about implementing anti-corruption measures, and they also understood the dangers that this part of the European integration may come and may create against the long-term interests of the Ukrainian oligarchs. And now we can actually see that the Ukrainian oligarchs have not benefited from the post-Euromaidan changes. With de-oligarchization, I mean, some of the extreme cases are, for example, Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky was supporting Euromaidan. He was supporting Ukraine in 2014. He was funding the first volunteer battalions. Now he's in prison. There are other big Ukrainian oligarchs like Firtash, who are under threats of Western persecution, sanctions, and so on. Even Akhmetov, not only he lost big parts of his property because of the Russian attack and occupation, in particular in Mariupol and in other parts of Donbass, but also because of Zelensky's de-oligarchization policy. Akhmetov decided to sell his media empire, a quite popular TV channel in Ukraine, which was a basis for his, as for many oligarchs, his influence on Ukrainian politics, simply because that was a requirement of, that would allow him to not to be counted formally as an oligarch, according to the new law. So the Ukrainian oligarchs were fragmented, and as a result, they were not capable to defend their long-term interests. Another class dimension for the war. And in terms of the threats, if this oligarchic class, right, it's incapable for kind of like hegemonic unity to be united around their long-term interests. The main solution for that is the Bonapartist regimes like Putin or Lukashenko, who coerce, who impose on the ruling class at least some of their collective interests. And also it works via coercion and also balancing, some pragmatic balancing of the interests of different fractions of the ruling class. But those regimes are not stable. One of the biggest problems is the successor problem, and that's why the leaders like Putin, Lukashenko need to go for many periods of re-elections, because it's quite a big problem how to choose a successor who would be actually capable to unite the elite, but at the same time would not overthrow his political father prematurely, and who would allow Putin, Lukashenko to retire and to feel safe behind of that. That's studied in a huge political science literature. And so this kind of regimes, they are vulnerable to revolutions, Maidan revolutions, particularly in Ukraine. And we also can look at the Russian invasion as a kind of counter-revolutionary war. The revolutions in the Russian periphery were starting to escalate. Euromaidan was just one of them, but then revolution in Armenia in 2019. Armenia was actually the Russian ally. Suppressed uprising in 2020 in Belarus. Actually suppressed with some important Russian support. An uprising in Kazakhstan in January 2022, just a month or a month and a half before the invasion to Ukraine. So when those uprisings are starting to multiply on the periphery, and plus also the protests in Russia, in 2011, 2012, the protests for fair elections against what was perceived as fraudulent elections first to the Russian parliament, and Putin's decision to be re-elected after Medvedev first presidency, and then the movement of Navalny, which was also inspiring quite significant protests, and also what has been evident in the continuous public opinion surveys in Russia, that the younger people are, the more oppositional they are. And this is the future. And if these younger people, they're becoming older, they're acquiring more important positions in the society, and they are significantly more skeptical towards Putin. This is a looming threat on the horizon. And so there was an important preventive counter-revolutionary element in the war, which fundamentally goes to the class structure of the post-Soviet society and the incapacity of the ruling class to claim proper hegemonic leadership. And in this situation, one of the possible solutions is coercion. And we can think about the war in Ukraine as escalation of coercion in the literally the same conflict that cut across the whole post-Soviet space. The same conflict which was suppressed with police batons in Belarus, in Russia itself, but is now fought with the use of tanks, drones, rockets in Ukraine.
I think I would have last two questions. Okay, okay. Follow up on what you just said is that, well, this whole argument that you presented could be understood as an argument for the imperialist and colonial aspect of this conflict. But in the book, you argue against it. So how would you yeah, how would you keep those two things together? Because if the conflict starts as a decision, I mean, it's not, we are not talking about what was literally expressed or even consciously thought. Yeah, we are talking about certain mechanisms. So I'm not claiming that Putin was saying, yeah, let's make a coercive move towards our succession problems, but or maybe that's actually kind of probable. I don't know, but I think that if that was the case, and the other aspect and reason for that would be to try to keep a certain important class of the society very closely intertwined and interconnected with the state apparatus in a hegemonic position, that is more or less what imperialism is about. You know, it's just exploiting either new territories or new dimensions of society to keep the gains of a ruling class, or a ruling class within a certain state apparatus that is imperialist. The wars that the United States were igniting in Middle East are obviously a way to keep this kind of gains moving. So why would you still say that you know, the discourse about Russian imperialism and Russian colonialism and the perspective that Ukraine now fights an anti-colonial war is wrong? Because if you look at Polish culture today, it's I would say it's a kind of Ukrainian Renaissance. That, you know, we learn very fast how to distinguish between the Russians and the Ukrainians. We have a lot of publications of Ukrainian authors, literature, art, and so on. Sometimes it's a little bit ironic as well, because Giga Vertov is now a Ukrainian artist, and so on. You know, this kind of stuff. Gogol, I think, was Ukrainian as well. I mean, you know, when you have a mass psychosis, you have a lot of phenomena that are kind of funny, but at the same time, I mean, it's a genuine move, you know, to disconnect from Russian culture, and it's very easy to understand it as an anti-colonial struggle. You know, it's struggle against the culture that was imposed or that was dominant. It's bigger, it's more influential, it's more powerful, and now the smaller country is finally gaining its cultural independence. So why would you oppose it?
Well, it's not.
I mean, not oppose the move, exactly, but the discourse of anti-colonial.
Yeah, it's not exactly that I oppose.
I'm not implying like that you oppose this. No. Yeah, it's just about
what you said, because well, there are some grains of truth even in that argument. But I would start from comparison, from how the Western imperialism is seen much more softly in our parts of the world. So basically, what our elites, and including and maybe even foremost, intellectual elites, civil society elites, want to integrate into the Western core. They want to become a part of the elite. And the wars, the exploitation, imperialism, the Western nations against many other parts of the world, but also even when they touched the Eastern Europe, are seen legitimately. This is something that was just supposed to happen. Why? Because, well, the West showed its supremacy. It's a stronger economy, it's a stronger politics, it's stronger, well, military powers, when we speak about the United States. So this is a kind of like legitimation of the exploitative structure. But, and even calling the things as they are, and they are imperialistic, and the Western states actually constructed the biggest colonial empires in their history, and they continued, maybe with different formal mechanisms, but they continued to impose the political will and keep a lot of control when we speak, for example, about the United States, about in many parts of the world, in Latin America, in Middle East, in parts of Asia. But this is not a problem. This is not something that we would refer as imperialism, as colonialism, right? But we start to think about imperialism in the Russian case, which is not legitimate. And I'm not legitimating it. I'm just pointing to this fact that this attempt to impose their will on Ukraine is actually comes from the problem that the Russian elite could not offer any attractive project. It could not compete with the soft power of the United States and the European Union that had such a big influence on, not necessarily on the whole of the Eastern European people, but for some very significant and influential groups. Speaking primarily about professional middle class. Russians could not offer anything like this. And precisely because they lacked this hegemonic power, even in their immediate neighborhood, they use coercive means. And this is also not a legitimation. This is just explanation. This is what happens. Fundamentally, it goes to the political economy of the post-Soviet Russia. So when we speak about imperialism and colonialism, first of all, and starting from the start of the discussion, we need to look at them globally, in a global perspective. And in that perspective, Russian imperialism would look very much differently if we only just have this tunnel vision, Russia, Ukraine, and only what happened between them and only what happened since very recently, only that matters. Because if you look, well, deep into the history, you would see Ukrainians actually at the highest position of the Russian colonial expansion into Siberia and into the Central Asia. You would find Ukrainians in the Russian imperial elite. We would find Ukrainians among those who actually created important parts of Russian culture, speaking about Gogol. And furthermore, the Soviet Union way how the relations between Ukrainians and Russians were restructured, it's also a very different story. So we would see that supposedly colonized nation was actually perceived as part of the imperial core of the Russian Empire. Ukrainians could not claim their separate identity as collective, because that would jeopardize the imperial project of kind of like three nations in the unity, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. But they were hardly discriminated as individuals. And when claiming themselves as Russians, they could make brilliant careers in the imperial structure. That complicates the discussion about colonialism, because that would require the discussion of the big variety of colonialism and saying that Ukrainians were as a colony in relation to Russia as India to Britain would not make much sense, in fact. And even within the Russian Empire, we would see different relations between Russians and Ukrainians, but then between Russians and Ukrainians in opposition to Central Asia and Siberia. And Ukrainians were important in colonizing some parts of the northern Kazakhstan or the Far East of the Russian Empire. Then the Soviet Revolution happens, and Ukraine experiences the breakthrough modernization, as many other parts of the Soviet Union. And then to which extent it makes sense to discuss it in the terms of colonialism, when typically the colonized states, those states which were colonized by the European nations, they were rather underdeveloped, not modernized, not revolutionized in that sense as what was happening in the Soviet Union. And especially from the point of view of Marxism, of the political left, speaking about that in the terms of colonialism and imperialism, that pushes us into kind of like very upside down vision of history, where the objective development and objective modernization and objective improvement of living standards of the large majority of Ukrainians, especially after the post-Stalinist years, just I'm not speaking about any apologetic view of the Soviet history. And in that book, I also describe my family history, which suffered from the Stalin repressions in particular. But objectively, what we see in the post-Stalin years in the Soviet Union was perhaps the period of the biggest prosperity for the biggest number of people who populated the Ukrainian land. The peak of Ukrainian economic and even cultural development. Speaking about the number of Ukrainian language books, Ukrainian language cinema, Ukrainian language press, Ukrainian language music, which we still have not caught up in the post-Soviet years of the independent Ukraine. Because of the post-Soviet economic catastrophe. That's the problem, and that's kind of like makes all the discussion about contemporary Ukraine as a post-colonial nation very kind of like questionable. And that what exactly the point is then to analyze it through the post-colonial lens. What is the analytical heuristic benefit? What is the political benefit? There are many other concepts to analyze political dependency, some everyday prejudices, discrimination, the development of identities. So, and when we use this post-colonial framework, it just brings so problematic connotations and discourses behind it, and with so questionable benefit. And of course, one of the risks which this framework brings to is the legitimation of ethno-nationalism. When whatever happened in the Soviet Union is supposed to be seen through very narrow lenses of very specific nation-building project, that which is furthermore is not even shared by many Ukrainians, even now. But when speaking about the previous decades, it was the minority faith. Actually, one of the books by Andrew Wilson that I mentioned before was called like this, Ukrainian Nationalism, a Minority Faith. That was published, I believe, in 2000, but which described the situation at that moment. Supposedly, now Russian invasion, as actually the dominant narrative goes on, united Ukrainians around this nation-building project. But what I would actually question this, because the unity against Russia does not necessarily mean a positive unity, a unity about some more articulated nation-building project. And a lot, unfortunately, now depends not so much on Ukraine, but on the United States, on the European Union, whether they would be capable to integrate Ukraine in a, in a way that would sustain and provide some material basis for Ukrainian further modernization. Because so far, it was what we have experienced in the post-Soviet years was rather the disintegration of the remains of the Soviet modernity, not necessarily with building an alternative modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the last question I have is actually the most global and general problem. And it's about the discourse of multipolarity, because we were talking about, you mentioned it, that, you know, the description of the conflict depends on what kind of lenses you have, how much in a close-up and how much in a more global or more broad perspective you try to have. And there is a discourse of that is trying to create this global narrative about multipolarity, in a sense that this conflict, among other recent events, is an important step to ending the unipolar moment or unipolar times of global domination by the United States. And in this narrative, particularly, Russia would be surprisingly on the side of as if fighting the anti-colonial war, even if the regime in Russia is autocratic and reactionary. That's not even very debatable, but it would bring a kind of liberation, because this unipolar hegemony and imperialism of the United States would end. And there are a lot of people talking about it. It's very popular, a lot of different points of view, I think. There are some who claim, like Michael Hudson and Radhika Desai, for example, that the multipolarity would necessarily bring about changes in the global economy that would somehow question also the neoliberal paradigm. I don't think that's, I mean, my immediate response to it would be, well, we'll see. But in your book, I think you allude to the fact that multipolarity could also very well look like very differently, not as a chance to build a kind of force of labor and more equal economical organization, but rather as a divided oligarchies. I mean, the global system divided into regional oligarchies that would, be subsumed to the authority of ruling classes. This is how you view it, or you still feel that it's not decided?
Well, I've mentioned many times, right, in our interview, but also in the book, hegemony crisis. We can think about this crisis on multiple levels. Well, on the level of the nation state, the crisis of the Ukrainian hegemony crisis of Ukrainian oligarchs who were not capable to build a stable political regime, or on the level of the region, the incapacity of the Russian ruling class to offer any attractive developmental project for the post-Soviet space. And that's why they need to rely so much on the coercion and war. On the global level, I think that what is typically called multipolarity now is simply the hegemony crisis of the United States, or the crisis of the US global hegemony. The scrambling of the institutions and ideologies that supported the American hegemony in the world, and which is now evidently declining. We see this on the level of the internal infight within the United States itself. We see the questions from the United States allies. We see how, for example, Israel behaves, how it wants to do, and even jeopardizing the interests of the American administration. And this is all the signs and manifestations that the way how the world was well internationally organized before is going through some change. But the change does not mean necessarily the emergence of a new hegemonic order. So far, we rather see fragmentation.
Yeah.
And the multipolarity means simply that, emergence of other poles. Perhaps China is, well, China is the obvious candidate for the new strong pole, but hegemonic, maybe, but not necessarily. Russia, other countries of the global south, whether EU is going to become another pole in the multipolar order, is actually a big discussion, right? And so the problem is that whether multipolarity has a positive articulation, or is it simply something post-American hegemony? That's it.
Mm.
And then it's also it becomes the question to the progressive forces, to the left.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to
the subaltern classes, right? So should we simply sit and have some hope that perhaps China would reorder the international order in some better way? Well, not necessarily. Even if such order may potentially emerge. And we also see that the multipolarity, right? It's objectively exacerbates some of the problems that have global implications and global dangers. So one of them is obviously the escalation of the wars. And in particular, the escalation of the war between Russia and Ukraine that may potentially go into the nuclear apocalypse. And this is the global concern now. That's the thing that we've started to talk from the very start. There are universal concerns. One of them is stable peace in the world, right? Another universal problem is climate change. Preventing catastrophic climate change requires global coordination. Global coordination is jeopardized when the geopolitical rivalry is intensified up to that point when the major states and major economies would not be capable to agree upon some of the necessary measures that would have global consequences. And so there are at least two issues, right, around which the universally relevant politics of the subaltern classes could build upon. This is peace, this is climate change. And instead of just simply cheerleading for multipolarity, we need to think how to use the new emerging conditions to push forward our own agenda, to how to organize around it, how to articulate it better, how to propose and lead forward alternative developmental projects for the whole world. And precisely that class or that power, which would be capable to offer some workable solutions in the common interests of the humanity, would be capable to lead the further hegemony, which potentially could come from some of the ruling classes, but not necessarily. Maybe this is also the point when the subaltern classes could offer their counter-hegemonic project around the issues which are of concern for the whole humanity. And well, one of the dimensions of the current crisis is actually the crisis of revolution. That great revolutionary wave which was started with the Soviet Revolution and which was expanding in many parts of the world, in China, in many parts of the Third World, it has well evidently degenerated. But no next revolutionary wave is in sight. So perhaps our task is to work on this and to work on the programs that would allow some workable solutions in the universal interests of the whole humanity.
Yeah, well, it comes to my mind, the concept of global majority that Russian diplomats like to use, but I think they mean the majority of rulers, and how to change it into an actual global majority of people, and their interests would be probably the task, no? To use the moment to really open up a space for political change.
Absolutely. The task for those people who don't like the people in Kremlin and who are quite ugly people, to put it mildly, is to articulate the interest of the global majority in a better way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We finally agree because we try to disagree all the time. Volodymyr Ishchenko, thank you very much for your time and for coming to our podcast. I'm really even more happy that you are the first English speaker in our new series, because it was a wonderful and fascinating talk. And well, I hope it's the first but not the last time, and I'm looking forward to your new publications, which every time I have a moment to read them are really refreshing and thought-provoking. So also I wish you all the luck with your research and analysis. Yeah, and well, hopefully the things that we were talking about are going to move in a direction which would be more positive and affirmative than catastrophic. And for our listeners and viewers, thank you for your attention, and stay with us for the next episodes in English and in Polish, whatever would come. Thank you, Volodymyr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.